1400s marked the beginning of a period in history called the Renaissance, where culture exploded. And where music's concerned, it passed from something that was largely plagal or churchy into something more secular and also more privately owned. There was a bunch of very powerful and rich Italian families living in areas like Florence, Venice, and Milan, who threw lavish parties and commissioned music to be played not in churches but in chambers, not unlike the one you see through there. But because they were a savvy bunch, they wanted the receipts, they wanted this music to be played repeatedly. So the composers of the day had to create or rely more on notation. Now, if you were a musician in Europe during this period, Italy was where the work was at. And because these compositions were being commissioned by Italian families, if you wanted to work as a musician in these chambers, these Italian chambers, you had to understand the Italian phrases or instructions that the composers were giving. Now, we're familiar with different playing styles. It's, starting with the more primordial, like banging of a drum or striking, or indeed in the case of stringed instruments, or bowing it. What this new form of music, being played in tighter, drier sounding environments like these chambers, required was a greater sense of interconnecting melodies, counterpoint. And in order to perform these melodies in a way that was lyrical, song-like, you employ a technique called legato, which is quite simply Italian for tied together. Now, there's a way that synths can imitate legato or tied together, and that's by creating something monophonic. That doesn't work with samples. Our ears are too sophisticated for that. Let me just quickly resample one of these sustained notes, middle C. So just turn this into a mono to imitate a mono synth. Sounding quite rubbish. One way that synths get around this is to create a bit of a glide between the notes. So suddenly a sample that sounds fairly realistic sounds absolutely rubbish. You're slowing down and speeding up the sample. It's to do with the fact that you don't have the natural connective tissue between the two notes. So sustains work very much when composing, when creating chordal structures. Now, taking that series of what's called passing notes in the bottom there, you can kind of get away with it. By making sure that the notes really butt up against each other. But what's happening with a sampler, every time you play a note, you're triggering the beginning of a note. Beginning of an instrument playing is not the same as it transitioning between two different notes. And this is what makes recording legato samples and programming them so laborious, because you have to basically take into account every possible interval. When you play quickly, you get a kind of blurring effect. Whereas with legato, it has a more natural sound. And dare I say it, just playing that simple phrase
it creates more of a emotional response. Something they're very useful for is working from a compositional point of view. Many of us are kind of recovering pop keyboard players, certainly speaking for myself. We tend to work in block chords. I don't know if it's because pop music stems from rock and roll, which stems from the guitar, which is, you're thinking much more in a chordal nature. What legatos do is take you back to the origins of composition, which is about separating different voices, actual voices, people singing, into intertwining melodies that form what's known as a counterpoint that creates the harmony. The easiest way to teach a singer how to learn their part, their harmony, is to create something that is truly melodic, something that can be remembered. And that's the genius of people like, the forefathers of modern harmony, Bach, Handel, the genius of creating interconnecting melodies that stand alone and are beautiful, but also work together as a harmony. So I've become a little bit more of a reformist where legato composition is concerned, because it makes you think of the individual parts, and in so doing, hopefully create some good part writing. And I think that we as listeners respond to the interconnecting lyrical nature of music as opposed to just block chords. So in order for a sampler to put some connective tissue between your notes, you need to tie them together. And this is where I hear a lot of mistakes in people using legato samples. And I'll show you what I mean. So, doesn't sound the same as... And that's because I'm overlapping the notes, as opposed to... So when we record them, we need to make sure that they overlap. Now, often, if you're a poor player like me, what you'll want to do when doing a big arrangement is quantize those, make sure they're all on the grid. And the problem with that is that the lengths of the notes don't adjust according to that quantization. And what you then get is a situation where you actually have separation between the notes where you had actually joined them up before. The way I get around this is a function called force legato in Logic. They changed the name of it, which is a little bit annoying. Trim note end, remove overlaps to following notes with an 8 ticks gap. So actually what I've done by forcing the overlap is there is a very tiny gap between those notes. There are different functions where you can force it to overlap by 4 ticks or whatever. Because I'm a control freak, what I tend to do is just do the force legato and then overlap the notes. Now, what I love about these different ways of working, whether it be short notes or long notes or legatos, is they make you approach the way you play your instrument differently. And now I was just testing the legatos the other day on glass strings, and it made me play something in a way that as a keyboard player I wouldn't usually play. I usually just do some chords, but actually created something that was melodic. And I noticed, for example, that the transitions between notes that were far apart there's something about feeling that reach that I was enjoying. So I stumbled across a riff, and I thought what I'd do is create a piece of music just using legatos, demonstrate this idea of considering every voice as a separate thread, as a separate melody line, to form different and unexpected harmonies. The care and attention I think that we need to create music that isn't agonizing to listen to. So I'm just going to set a nominal level on the faders here. Okay, so that is a square phrase in the sense that it is 8 bars long. Let's just do this forced legato thing. So what I'm going to do is come up with some contrapuntal counterpoint lines that form harmonies to that. I'm not going to be too mindful of parts crossing and all of this kind of stuff, which I won't bore you with, but basically it's going to be a knotted kind of ball of counterpoint that I'm hoping is going to be unpredictable and keep our interest. So what I'm going to do is, as I build up the parts, I'm going to make sure that the other parts aren't square. Like that, keeps you guessing. And then what I'm going to do is just copy that down. Got this new function on glass strings where we can create a solo bass part. So that would be an octave down. Right, I like that, and because it's the law, I'm going to put a sub bass underneath that bass so you can really feel it. But this isn't a set and forget kind of vibe. I think something I'd love to do is play with the different mic positions. There's a recording of Fratras, which is a piece by Arvo Pärt, whose influence probably on me hasn't escaped you. And it sounds like that they've got a violinist to start from outside the hall, or certainly away from a microphone, and come into focus. And I thought it would be really interesting to mess around with these different perspectives. I think that also this piece will suit something that Steve Reich did, is by creating these phasing patterns, he ekes out the various different strange harmonies and sub-melodies that appear to be formed through the contrapuntal ball of wool, again to hold interest. But also, you would have noticed I would just played these in without the necessary variation in expression, which again can make the whole thing sound tiresome. So I think that that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to arrange it into a 3 or 4 minute piece. I'm going to have the parts transpose into different registers and keys. Going to mess around with the microphone positions, and then physically record in expression performances, if you will, to eke out a more human, more pleasurable listening experience. Right, so before I play this down, I think what's really exciting for me, someone who hasn't been a fan of legato, is what testing this legato functionality on glass strings has done, which is linked in the video link down below if you'd like to have a look at it. is made me just kind of is forced me into creating something that's made up of a series of layered melodies, if you will, to create a counterpoint, and in so doing, creating a harmonic structure that is of my making, but less reliant on my muscle memory as a dodgy old pop keyboard player.